Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 2, and we'll begin with Chapter 16 on the endocrine system. So it begins with similarities between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and both of them use chemicals. In the nervous system, they are neurotransmitters, and in the endocrine system, they're hormones. Receptors are required for these chemicals, so they will not be have any effect unless there's a receptor on the cell. Both are regulated by negative feedback, and both preserve homeostasis. The important thing here is to look at the Paracrine Communication, and these are cells that release chemicals that affect nearby cells with receptors. Paracrine Communication. Hormones are basically in two categories. They are in the protein or protein-like category and the lipid or lipid-like category. So the protein-like category includes amino acid derivatives, peptides, and proteins. Some examples of amino acid derivatives are thyroid hormones and catecholamines. Catecholamines is a general term that includes the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine and dopamine. And tryptophan is an amino acid derivative. So looking here, you don't need to know these structures, but keep in mind that the amino acid derivatives and the peptide hormones are protein-like. Proteins are made of amino acids. Proteins are formed from peptide bonds. It just means that these are molecules that are made of amino acids. Lipids clearly are not. Lipids are made of fatty acids, such as the prostaglandin, or made of this ring structure cholesterol precursor with 4 rings. Peptide hormones are common in the body, and they are first made in an inactive form called a prohormone, and then they will be activated. You don't need to know all these examples of peptide or amino acid derivatives. The lipid derivatives include 2 categories, one that is made up of fatty acids such as the eicosanoids. These are important paracrine factors. Leukotrienes and prostaglandins are examples. And you can see here this fatty acid-like structure here. And then steroids. Steroids are released by the reproductive hormones, the ovaries and testes. They are released by the adrenal gland as corticosteroids, and the kidneys as calcitriol. And you can see with these steroid hormones, there's a 4-chain structure. Pardon me, a 4-ring structure. Which of the following is not one of the chemical classifications of hormones? Nucleic acid derivative. So in the endocrine system, we talk mostly about these glands that secrete hormones, and that's their primary function. That is their major function, to secrete hormones. But we will also see throughout the body some organs that secrete hormones, not as their major function, but as a minor function. And that would be secondary hormone secreting roles. Minor is secondary, major is primary. So if you just look at the chart of endocrine glands, those are the ones whose hormones whose production of hormones is a primary function. Secondary function would include heart, kidneys, digestive tract. So here's an overview of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus up in the brain is involved in homeostasis, and it secretes hormones that control other hormones. The pituitary gland secretes quite a few hormones, 7 of them, and we'll talk about those in great detail. So you can see the hypothalamus and pituitary up in the brain. The pituitary is located in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Thyroid gland is in your neck, and it secretes hormones that affect calcium and our metabolic rate. Adrenal glands basically have two different glands, an inner one, the adrenal medulla, the outer one, and they will secrete hormones involved in mineral balance, metabolic control. Our stress hormone is from the adrenal gland, and the sympathetic hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine, are from the adrenal glands. You clearly cannot see the left adrenal gland here because it's hidden behind the stomach, but there are two of them. The pancreas is in the curve of the stomach, and that secretes hormones that will increase or decrease blood glucose levels. Pineal gland secretes melatonin that affects our circadian rhythm. That's the day-night cycle that we have. And the parathyroid hormone is important in calcium regulation. The hormones with the organs that have hormone production as a secondary function would be the heart, the digestive tract, the reproductive organs. So we needed to know the two different categories of hormones because how they affect the cell depends on their chemical structure. So remember, we had the protein-like hormones and we had the lipid-like hormones. So some hormones need a receptor outside the cell, and that would be a hormone that can't get into the cell by itself. So that would be the protein-like hormone. So the protein-like hormones will have receptors in the plasma membrane. And I hope you remember that the protein hormones were called amino acid derivatives and peptides. So without that receptor, the hormone will not get into the cell and will have absolutely no effect on the cell. The second type of hormone, the lipid-like hormone, can just get right through the plasma membrane and will often directly affect the DNA. So we'll go into a little bit of detail on the two possible receptor locations. The first one is in the plasma membrane, and this is for not only the peptide and amino acid hormones, but the catecholamines, which were epinephrine and norepinephrine and dopamine, and the eicosanoids, which were the fatty acid hormones, such as leukotrienes and prostaglandins. So that hormone, let's say it's epinephrine. Epinephrine will act as the first messenger. It will bind to the receptor, and that binding will cause the receptor to change shape because proteins are affected by binding and they change shape, and then it will activate a G protein. And so in this diagram you can see that the hormone, once it's accepted by the protein receptor, will activate the G protein. And now that G protein will go on to do a couple of different things. One would be to increase cyclic in that video AMP levels, and it can also affect the calcium levels. So here are examples of those second messengers. Remember, the first messenger is the hormone itself. The second messenger would be cyclic AMP. And what that's going to do is activate enzymes or open channels. And it's going to change the metabolic activity in the cell. And then calcium ions is a second messenger. And again, that will activate enzymes. You can pause the PowerPoint here and watch the video, but we will skip that. So we started this with saying there were two possible receptor locations. So we talked about the protein receptors that are on the outer plasma membrane, and now we're going to talk about the intracellular steroid hormone receptors. And these steroid hormones differ in that they can go right through the plasma membrane, and they can affect different things in the cell. It might bind to the DNA and cause it to make RNA and therefore make a new protein. It's going to change the activity in the cell somewhat. Thyroid hormones, an example of the steroid hormone, can be transported across the cell membrane, and then it will bind to both the mitochondria and inside the nucleus to change transcription of the DNA. Which of these types of hormones binds to a plasma membrane receptor? So that means it has to bind to the outside of the cell. It's an extracellular receptor. We just saw thyroid go into the cell. We know steroid and eicosanoids are both lipids, so it must be the peptide hormone. So the hypothalamus has 3 ways that it controls many different endocrine glands. It provides the highest level of endocrine function by integrating nervous and endocrine systems. The first method is the secretion of 2 hormones. One is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and the second is oxytocin. So the hypothalamus, which is superior to the pituitary, synthesizes the 2 hormones, ADH and oxytocin. The second method of control is that the hypothalamus secretes regulatory hormones. By regulatory, they can excite or inhibit, and these will control the anterior pituitary. And the hypothalamus also contains autonomic, remember that's the same as automatic, centers that directly stimulate the endocrine cells in the adrenal medulla, the center of the adrenal glands, and that is in response to the sympathetic activation. So that would cause the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So here you can see that the hypothalamus releases 2 hormones. The hypothalamus releases regulatory hormones that go and affect the anterior pituitary, and the hypothalamus has autonomic centers that control the adrenal medulla and causing it to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. The hypothalamus has control over the adrenal gland because of the hypophyseal portal system. The hypophysis is the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary is the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. But there's a great little capillary network around the anterior pituitary so that the hormones produced by the hypothalamus get right into the blood and are really centered on the anterior pituitary before they go throughout the body. So here you can see the great blood supply, and so it's surrounding that anterior pituitary, and this is the hypophyseal portal system. Don't worry about this median eminence and all that nonsense. Just basically understand what that hypophyseal portal system is doing. What 2 specific endocrine structures are connected by a portal system? The hypothalamus and the anterior lobe of the pituitary.